Tonight, you can think of this as really an introduction to the mental health map. I'm going to start with really an introduction to how we perceive personalized mental health care, how we can see how genetics can play a role, both the value as well as the limitations, because I think it's important to explore both of those and have an understanding in what genetics can and cannot do in clinical practice. I'm then going to basically give you a review, an introduction, I should say, to the mental health map. Another thing you're going to receive tomorrow after the presentation, along with the recordings and a copy of these slides, is I'm going to give you access to the interactive report itself so that you can continue to explore on your own. There is a lot of information in the panel, in the report. There's no way that we could really do a deep dive tonight. But as I said, we are splitting this up. So think of this as tonight's presentation as really a primer to give you an introduction to what the mental health map is. And you will also receive a invitation within the next 2 or 3 weeks to a discussion next month where we'll actually have a special guest, Dr. Keith Vallone, a good friend of mine, who was actually very instrumental in us actually having this presentation tonight, and I'll explain more on that later. He's a founder and CEO of Arroyos Treatment Centers and the Arroyos Psychological Associates in Pasadena, California. He leads a multifunctional team of therapists and prescribers focused primarily on diathesis stress, or I should say stress diathesis disorders. And as I said, he was one of the early adopters. Is how I actually got to know him, and was actually sort of gave us a perspective shift in what mental health map could actually mean for clinicians as well. And Laura, just so you know, I don't know if you see it, but I'm seeing some people in the waiting room. I just let them in, but I don't know if you can see that. If not, we might need to address that. So I'm going to start a discussion talking about what we call mental health 360. So this is basically a model for how Genomind approaches a personalized approach for mental health. And it really just starts very simple. It's a very simple model. We all know that mental health is a function of environment, lifestyle, and experiences. So, for example, we know that socioeconomic status, apparently I've lost my ability to speak English tonight, and family home life are really important for human behavior and cognitive development. We know that physical fitness, social life, especially social life, I think has been emphasized by recent world events, is very important, as well as other experiences, so trauma, abuse, other issues like that. And yet we also know that there's another component. There's an inherent sort of constitutional factor as well. I had the opportunity, when I was a younger man, I served in the Navy, and I had the opportunity to serve in humanitarian missions. I also, as a civilian, I served in medical missions in developing countries, including Haiti, and it always fascinated me. I think this is really where my career in behavioral genetics took off. It fascinated me that two individuals, brothers even, who were raised in the same environment, lived the same lifestyle, had the same similar experience, the same exposed to the same trauma, would have very different responses to that event. One would be able to go past that or even thrive, and another would continue to struggle. And that speaks to some inherent quality that I think we understand. We've, even before we cracked the human genome, almost 2 decades ago, we knew that family history played a large role in the risk of developing similar disorders in the future. But only recently have we really exponentially developed an understanding of the specific genetics and the variants that really impact this, and the specific proteins and receptors and enzymes that play a role in this. And that's really what we're focused on tonight. However, the reason why I wanted to start with this model, because I think this very simply and elegantly shows both the value and the promise of genetic testing in mental health, but also the limitations as well. And to illustrate that, I'm actually going to give you a personal example. I'm going to actually disclose to you my genetics that I learned through taking my mental health map. And it's this specific variant. By variant, I mean a change in the genetic code, which I'll touch on, in this gene called CACNA1C. Now, that gene name doesn't mean much to you, but it encodes, it provides the blueprint to make the voltage-gated calcium channel. And I'll explain a little bit more on that in a bit. Now, there's many things, there's many different ways that you can analyze DNA. What our company does is we look at the small changes in the genetic code. So, for example, in this gene, most of you listening to this program tonight, the majority of humans on Earth actually, at this specific site that we test, have a G allele, guanine. Or you may have, an A allele there, one copy of an A, an adenine. And what I mean by that is everyone has 2 copies of each gene. We have 1 copy from our mom, 1 copy from our dad. Now, most of us have 2 G alleles. Some of us have 1 A allele because we inherited that adenine from one of our parents. I, however, inherited an A allele from both of my parents. And in genome-wide association studies, so these are studies, hundreds of thousands of individuals where they look at those with a disorder and those without, and look at what's different in their genetics. We've learned that just being born with my genotype increases my risk of being diagnosed with bipolar disorder 1 and schizophrenia by about 15 to 20%. Wow, okay. So I see some of you have your screen on. So I guess I should be taking lithium or an antipsychotic. Would you agree with that?
No.
No? Okay. Of course not, right? I'm not distributing symptoms of schizophrenia or bipolar. I'm pretty sure the voice I just heard was real. So why is this useful to me? Why is this information useful to me to know that I have this genotype? Well, it actually has to do with the underlying biology and looking at how that might impact overall behaviors, not diagnosing a mental health disorder. Genetics cannot diagnose people. There is no such thing as a schizophrenia gene or a bipolar gene. Genes don't encode disease, they encode proteins and receptors and enzymes. In this case, this encodes for the voltage-gated calcium channel. And this is a channel that lives here on the axon terminal. Now, we've all, I think, been exposed or learned a little bit about neurobiology. We know that a neuron propagates a signal using depolarization that travels down the axon. That signal hits this voltage-gated calcium channel, which allows calcium to flood into the cell, and that triggers the release of the next neurotransmitter. It causes degranulation. My genotype, this A allele, my specific genotype, is associated with increased expression of these channels. What does that mean for me? Well, basically, it means I'm likely to make more of these channels. So it's almost like having a hair trigger. Again, I've lost my ability to speak, a hair trigger for these neurons to fire. And why is it important? Why were we interested in this gene and been learning more? Well, because the whole point of that genome-wide association study where we linked it to bipolar is not that we're interested in this gene to diagnose bipolar, but the fact that it's so highly significant as a risk factor means that this might likely plays a role in the etiology of developing that disorder. And when we start to hone in on specific behaviors, not just those with a disorder, but healthy volunteers, we see that this is associated with increased tendency towards certain behaviors that we all display to a certain extent. And we all fall somewhere on a spectrum from adaptive to maladaptive. Those with my genotype with excessive excitatory signaling, it's associated with mood lability and neuroticism. It's associated with sleep latency, trouble falling asleep, a heightened startle response. And if you think about this, mood lability, neuroticism, sleep latency, trouble falling asleep because the neurons keep on going, a heightened startle response because you have a hair trigger for the neuron to fire, this is all starting to congeal into a narrative here as to why this might be involved. And so the value isn't to say, oh, you're at increased risk of bipolar, but rather, hey, if you're struggling with any of these behaviors, maybe this plays a role in that. And so what I'm going to call out here is, again, that gene, you wouldn't diagnose someone with bipolar because they have a specific gene. Similar to how you would not diagnose someone for PTSD just because they were exposed to trauma or that they were raised in a poor home life. But when you combine all these factors together, their genetic predispositions based on the neurobiology, the underlying root cause, plus their actual behavior and these other experiences, then we've gained great insight into how this provides resolution and how to target and personalize a treatment approach to these patients. And our entire platform at Genomind is designed not just to provide the genetic information, but actually provide education and resources and further information so you can plug that into these other factors, because that's really where it makes a difference. And we have two primary genetic tests, that two major things in our arsenal that allows us to do this. The first is the Genomind Mental Health Map, which is what we're discussing tonight. And another is the Genomind Professional PGX Express test. So if this is a test that you're interested in, I realize that we have a few prescribers on tonight. And if you're not familiar with this is a genetic test that looks at genes that modulate a response to medication, both the pharmacodynamic genes, so dopamine receptor, serotonin transporter, as well as the pharmacokinetic genes, so how we metabolize different drugs, so phase 1 and phase 2 enzymes. If that's something you're interested, please notify Dr. Nguyen, and he'll follow up with you and provide more information on that. Tonight, we're actually focused on the Genomind Mental Health Map, which does not need to be ordered by a prescribing clinician, and actually does not need to be interpreted by prescribing clinicians. It's actually a direct consumer test designed to really lower the threshold to take ownership of one's own behavior. So some of you might be wondering, why then have I received this invitation to learn about this test, which seems to be direct to consumer, but this whole event seems to be targeted towards clinicians? Well, it actually goes back to Dr. Keith Vallone, who you'll have a chance to meet next month, as well as other clinicians who came to us after we launched this test. We had actually no intention to actually target this for clinical utility. This was really designed for consumers. But when these consumers who happened to be patients brought it to their psychologists, to their psychiatrists, and started actually having these discussions, they found that it really augmented, it enhanced their treatment approach. And I hope to give you some ideas of how that might apply to your case. But first, I just want to give you some basics. Again, this whole night is really just an introduction to the mental health map. And then we're going to give you lots of tools, lots of goodies, so that you continue to explore on your own, as well as contact us for more information. So just the process, what this is, right? How you collect the sample is just a simple cheek swab. So you don't have to draw blood. It's very non-invasive. The client can receive this in their home. They can have this sent to direct to their home address, or you can order these to have these in your clinic, and you can swab them there. You send it in, and within 3 to 5 days after we receive it here at the lab, they receive their interactive report. And actually, I should say reports plural, because the mental health map itself is not a report. It actually is comprised of 7 different genetic reports. The stress and anxiety report, the mood report, focus and memory, these what we call capabilities. These reports represent core clusters of behaviors or traits or symptoms that are distinct, but they overlap, they influence each other. And the whole term mental health map comes from the idea of looking at the inherited variants, the variations, these changes in the genetic code that some of us received from our ancestors, but others didn't, that impact the connections between these domains. I gave you the example of my inherited variant, which had an impact on cognition, sleep, mood, and stress and anxiety. And when you can combine the narrative that shows how these things are connected, what we find is the adherence.
Hi guys, really?
I want to ask you I really welcome questions if you want to pipe up, but if you don't have a question, if you could mute yourself, I think that would be helpful for everyone else. I think I was getting towards, and Laura, can you help with the muting?
Ryan, yep.
Yep, thank you. So I think what I was getting at is these different capabilities, these different reports. It's really looking at how these different clusters of behaviors are all important for mental health and how they are combined. And hopefully we'll be able to give you a better example of that tonight. To explore one of these capabilities further, these reports further, we can talk about the organization, because there is a lot of information in the mental health map. And so we organize each report by traits. And you can think of these traits as additional subclusters of behaviors or symptoms that, again, are distinct, but they overlap, they influence each other. When it comes to stress and anxiety, the 3 traits we're looking at is stress response, which is our visceral, immediate response to stress, adaptability, which is how we're predisposed to adapt to certain situations, and then anxiety, which is how, well, stress is expressed in our behavior over time, usually as a function of the other 2. We've curated a panel looking at basically all the literature basically performed to date, all the studies performed to date, all the top genetic variants that seem to impact proteins, receptors, or enzymes that impact predisposed individuals to certain behaviors within these traits. So heightened fear response or stress response, startle, dopamine signaling. So the basically increased or decreased dopaminergic tone impacts our ability to thrive in chaos versus thriving in structure, it seems. Worry, nervousness, tension, the list goes on. But I want to point out that, for example, if you're treating a patient for anxiety, similar to there's not a lot of value in telling someone that they have an increased risk of schizophrenia, telling someone that they have an increased, they are predisposed to a heightened stress response. Well, if they're already struggling with anxiety, this is not news to them. But we actually find that there is value here because it provides validation. It starts with validation. Oh, it's not just me, it's based on my biology. And actually to explore the biology further, that's where we focus on the mechanism, what we call the biological mechanism. In this case, the mechanism is stress hormone regulation. And the genes are CRHR1 and FKBP5. Now, again, these gene names don't mean much to you. You can think of this as the on switch proteins or receptors that act as the on switch or the off switch for the fight or flight response. This individual we're calling out as being predisposed to a heightened stress response because of their genotype in the FKBP5 gene, which is the off switch. And to explore this further, exactly how this works, FKBP5 is actually a binding protein that its only job actually is to bind glucocorticoid receptor. And glucocorticoid receptor is an example of a nuclear receptor, and meaning that it has to get into the nucleus to do its job and turn on certain genes and turn off others. But FKBP5, it prevents glucocorticoid receptor from doing that. What I've lost my ability to speak. What glucocorticoid receptor does in the brain is it's actually involved in the negative regulation of the fight or flight response, the sympathetic response. It's actually involved in the parasympathetic response, turning off that fight or flight response when we're no longer running away from the tiger, lion, or bear. And how this works is when we are exposed to a threat and we have elevated levels of cortisol in our system, including our brain, that spike in cortisol actually kicks FKBP5 off of glucocorticoid receptor, which allows it to go into the nucleus, turn things on when it actually turns off the fight or flight response, which then lowers cortisol. And so this is a really elegant sort of allosteric curve. You get just the right amount of stress hormones when you need it, and then when you no longer need it, you can turn that down. It allows us to turn off the fight or flight response. It's sort of like the thermostat, if you will. But this individual's genotype is TT. Most of us have a C allele here, either CC or CT. This individual is a homozygote for the T allele. And this is associated, similar to my genotype with the voltage-gated calcium channel, with increased expression of FKBP5. And what happens here is with increased levels of FKBP5, it requires higher and higher levels of cortisol to kick it off. It's basic competitive inhibition. With more FKBP5, you can think of two gangs that are fighting. FKBP5 has a bigger posse, so it takes more cortisol to fight it off of glucocorticoid receptor. And we can see the effects of this in real time. In fact, what we mean by a heightened stress response is the actual physiological response to stress. And this is actually studied in healthy volunteers, usually college-age kids, in something called the Trier-Social Stress Test. I guess college-age kids because they're willing to do anything for a free lunch. This is where they take these individuals and they'll put them in some type of stressful situation. The most common one that they do is social stress, which is they put them in front of an audience and tell them to do a speech or something. And then they measure their salivary cortisol, and those with this individual's genotype, the increased FKBP5 genotype, their cortisol levels go through the roof compared to those with more common genotype. So where we're getting with this is now we start with validation. If this is something that the patient is struggling with, maybe now we have an understanding as to one of the things that's driving that etiology, why they may have that increased sensitivity to stress. For our ancestors, this would be a great thing. This likely helped them survive because they were facing lions and tigers and bears on a weekly, if not daily basis in some cases. Us modern humans, of course, we're no longer faced with those threats. And of course, you can continue to explore what that might mean for the patient on your own. The main thing is by understanding the biology, it provides a few things. It's validation. Oh, it's not just in my head. It's not just that I'm weak or broken. This is based on something I inherited from our ancestors. This is how I might be wired. And once we learn that, it gives us a plan for improvement. There are things we can do to target this pathway. Now, of course, the genetics is just one component. We actually want to assess actual behavior. So within the mental health map, as you will see on your own, as you continue to explore, we provide access to screeners, the GAD-7, the PHQ-9, the pediatric symptom checklist. So they can continue to explore these on their own. And what we find is that this gives them the empowerment, the vocabulary to explore their own feelings, and actually accelerates and enhances the discussion that they have with you, their provider. Now, as I said, there is a lot of information. You'll see this firsthand when you go through the report. And it's easy to imagine how clients or patients can get overwhelmed and perhaps even misinterpret this. So as I said, Genomind, it's not just, we don't just sell genetic tests. What we really offer, what all of us at Genomind truly believe in, is taking this to the next level and bringing a personalized approach to mental health, because we see the power it can have. So each mental health map comes with a free consultation with what we call the Genomind advisor. So this is not a therapist, it's not a psychiatrist. This is someone who's either a geneticist or someone who is a health coach and has been trained in the interpretation. Their whole job is just to walk them through how to navigate the report. And I'm going to give you a sample of that tonight, actually, because really, like I said, this is going to be an introduction. I'm actually going to give you an idea of what a typical consumer would receive when they have their first consult with myself or Dr. Nguyen or one of our health coaches. So I'm actually, this is going to be a choose your own adventure type of thing. I think Laura is going to put a poll on the screen, and you get to tell me where you want to start our navigation, where you want to start our exploration. The mental health map, as I said, there's 7 different capabilities we could explore. You tell me where you want to start it. Oh, looks like stress and anxiety is in the lead.
Poll is live.
Yep.
This is where someone needs to be singing the Jeopardy song.
Yeah. A Jeopardy song and sort of a waiting song as we're waiting for people to join us at the beginning. There you go. We got a pretty hefty lead for stress and anxiety. 23 out of 38 have voted. Do we want to call
that's your runaway winner right there.
Yeah, I think we're going to call that. So I'm going to end polling. I'm going to share results so you can all see it. So so stress and anxiety. So basically, everyone can see my screen right now. Am I sharing the right screen, Laura?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is the actual interactive report. And like I said, you're going to have access to this report tomorrow. We're actually going to give you access to this so you can continue. I've lost my ability to speak. You can continue to explore this on your own. And it starts here, basically a welcoming page for the mental health map. And that's where you can schedule a consult. And then you can also, and this may be of interest to you, some of you genetics gurus out there, you can have access to our report references. This is essentially our white paper. Basically, everything that we claim on the mental health map is based on published literature, and we're very transparent on that. So you can actually explore this on your own, including links to PubMed itself, so you can access the studies directly. When we go to the report itself, we can access the stress and anxiety report. And I'm going to show you how each report is layered. So that people are not overwhelmed all at once. And at the beginning, right, we start with stress and anxiety. We explore how the reports are organized, as I think I covered this before, how we look at 3 traits: stress response, adaptability, and anxiety. And we call it, the first trait is stress response. And I always find it's important when I'm talking to clients, whether they're patients or people who are just interested in wellness, improving their general resilience, to start here, because this really is at the crux of understanding the physiology of anxiety, right? This is a natural process. Anxiety is actually an adaptive process that allowed our ancestors to survive. And of course, it's somewhat reductionist, going back to that triune brain, that, talking about the reptile brain versus human brain. And of course, there's some debate regarding the accuracy of that, but it's a narrative that seems to resonate with patients, with clients. It makes sense because it's really validates that this is something that can be good in some contexts, right? That a heightened stress response in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It really depends on what we do with that. And that leads us towards things that we can do to control that. Grounding exercises, CBT, etc. We also provide direct links to videos because people have different learning styles. So those who are more audiovisual, they'll have access to basically someone on my team basically describing everything that you could either read or just listen to us do it for you. As we scroll down, you'll see actually in this case, that same gene I covered before, FKB5, this individual is a heterozygote, but that's what we call normal activity. Normal activity, all that means is it doesn't mean that the alternative is abnormal. It just means that we looked at these two genes and this individual's genotype is not associated with any type of known or clearly elucidated physiological impact. And so normal activity, it doesn't mean that stress and anxiety is not a concern. It just means if it is, this isn't the likely culprit. This isn't necessarily the thing to focus on. But we do call out a heightened stress response for a different mechanism. In this case, it's BDNF. And I think many of you are probably familiar with BDNF, but I like to showcase this because I want you to see how we explore this mechanism with your patients. And just to basically really briefly touch on this, BDNF stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is like a brain cell growth protein. When we're first born, when we're neonates, we have billions of neurons, but they're not doing anything. They're not connected. Well, that's why when we're first born, we have about 1,000-fold increase in BDNF levels in our brain than we do as adults, because it's stimulating these neurons to form these connections with each other, reach out and contact each other and form these networks. Around the age of 6, BDNF has done its job almost too well, and we actually have lots of these connections that aren't doing anything, which is why any of you who have children can attest to this. Around the age of 6, we're all a little psychotic. We're not very rational beings. But it's also where we do our best learning, because that's where BDNF flips the switch and begins, I clicked the wrong button. It flips the switch and actually starts pruning those connections we no longer need, and it reinforces those connections we do need. So it's basically the central neuroplasticity engineer. It's the main guy, if you will. Well, this individual's genotype is VALMET. So this is valine versus methionine. And in genetics, whenever you have a valine to a methionine shift, that's a bulky amino acid to a shrimpy one, that's causing decreased activity of the protein. And that's what this is associated with. And similar to how I described before, the trier-social stress test, consistently, this has been replicated time and time again, individuals with this genotype tend to have higher cortisol levels when exposed to stress. So let's talk about what we can do about that. So we do provide what's called genotype-based recommendations. So a genotype-based recommendation means, hey, what we're about to talk about for you may be particularly important. And in this case, BDNF represents this very important link between the brain and the body. When our ancestors were exerting themselves physically, they were likely doing something important for their survival. So we evolved this mechanism by which whenever we exert ourselves physically, we boost BDNF directly in the brain. So this individual's genotype is associated with decreased BDNF activity. Exercise increases BDNF activity and expression. So this is a natural way to target this underlying mechanism. But we can go further. We can show you direct outcome data that shows that this works. So we walk through this study, and we provide, again, videos that walk them through this as well. This was a study of over 1,000, a little over 1,000 veterans, soldiers, I should say, who were exposed to battle trauma. And not surprisingly, those with this genotype, this increased stress sensitivity genotype, they had increased rates of PTSD and more severe symptoms. When they stratified those soldiers by their physical activity level, those who had the increased rate of physical activity did not have the increased risk. So we have actual outcome data that shows that if you follow this genotype-based recommendation, it can improve outcomes. But also remember what I said before about the interconnectivity of these domains. And we all know, I think, that there's a really important link between stress and anxiety and cognition. And I think BDNF also represents a very important link here as well. So if we go over to the focus and memory report, and we explore this, and we can actually see that this same genotype in BDNF has also been linked to decreased working memory scores. Basically, they test this by giving you a series of numbers and telling you to repeat it back. Now, unlike heightened stress response, which could be an upside if you're one of our ancestors, or if you're an EMT or a soldier, that could be adaptive in some situations. There does not seem to be an upside to decreased working memory. But here's the thing. When it comes to mental health genetics, it's not like some of us have bad genes and others have good genes. Rather, we inherited from our ancestors genetic variants that provide some type of benefit in one environment, but cause us to struggle in others. And I want to really double down on exercise here. Again, exercise seems so pedantic, right? Everyone knows exercise is good for them. But for these individuals, this is where you really want to double down on this and hone in on the importance of physical activity, because there really is direct outcome data that shows that this works particularly well in those with this genotype. So this was a study of over 1,000 volunteers, not soldiers necessarily, who gave a genetic sample and they took a test of working memory. And on average, us modern sedentary humans, compared to our ancestors who have this genotype, they tend to have decreased scores of working memory. But when you look at these individuals as they increase their physical activity level, not only do they compensate for that impaired working memory, they actually end up exceeding the scores of those with a more common genotype. And if you think about this, for our ancestors, they likely were not as sedentary as we are today. So for them, this genotype likely gave them an edge. This was adaptive. It's only based on our modern lifestyle that this can actually be deleterious. And I think that right there, if we had to end right now and go to Q&A, I think that provides some insight into the value of mental health map. It's not telling you really necessarily what's wrong with you, or it's not diagnostic, but it provides some insight into the personalized actions that one can do to go further. I should actually, though, just touch on a few other things. So in addition to the genotype-based recommendations, I'll actually go back to stress and anxiety. In addition to the genotype-based recommendations, we also provide insight into basic, evidence-based approaches to address stress and anxiety, or cognition, or eating behavior, things that they can do to sort of take control, or sort of get internal locus of control, that this is something that they can sort of improve with your help, of course. So we give them an introduction to mindfulness and meditation practices, because we know that this improves outcomes in the Trier social stress test. In that same study where people have higher cortisol, when they practice meditation, they actually show a significant decrease in that cortisol response. So it's not necessarily addressing BDNF itself, but it's definitely addressing the behavior. The same goes for box breathing, or breathing exercises, or other grounding exercises, and you'll find those throughout the report. You'll see that we also, in this case, not as applicable if you use this for your patients, but remember, this is a direct to consumer, so some individuals, they might not be seeing a clinician at this time. We provide insight into how to approach getting help if this is a specific concern. We provide access to the GAD-7 through Mental Health America, which is a leading mental health advocacy group. And what we find is, for those who have a hard time expressing their behavior, or have a hard time coming to terms with their struggle, this is sometimes the key. And we actually, there's data that shows this, that just giving them access to this tool empowers them, it gives them the vocabulary to actually have that important discussion with you, their provider. And then, of course, if they don't have a provider, if you are a Genomind user, they would gain access to a list of our Genomind users in their area, so they can reach out for help.